Now I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled Preparation, Presence, and Practice, the 3 Fundamentals of Public Speaking. Our presenter today is Michael O'Toole. Michael leads the Grad Talk program at UChicago Grad, where he helps graduate students and postdocs improve their public speaking skills and prepare for interviews, presentations, and job talks. Michael received a PhD from the Department of Music at the University of Chicago in 2014 and developed his public speaking skills over several years, presenting his research at national and international conferences. He organizes the University of Chicago's annual 3-minute thesis competition, working with graduate students to help them prepare concise and engaging 3-minute presentations of their thesis research. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael O'Toole.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today and welcome you in the audience to this webinar. I'm very excited to be sharing some thoughts and suggestions and some ways of thinking differently about public speaking with you today. I imagine that many of you might have decided to join this webinar because you don't like public speaking, but perhaps you have to do it a lot as part of your profession or as part of your career. Others of you might actually like public speaking, but perhaps there's something that you feel you want to work on or something that you feel you could improve when it comes to your public speaking skills and, in particular, public speaking confidence. So I'm very happy today to be able to ideally help all of you in the audience to learn a few concrete strategies that you can apply to your next presentation or speech or any kind of public speaking context that you're getting ready for. Public speaking is a very broad term. It can mean a lot of different things, and I think that's a good thing. As Sam mentioned, I am an advisor at UChicago Grad, which is the central advising office for graduate students and recent graduate alumni at the University of Chicago. And I spend a lot of time working with students, not just on presentations, but also on interviews. And I think an interview is a form of public speaking as well. And so hopefully, whether or not you're preparing a presentation or whether or not you're thinking about improving your interview skills, you'll find some helpful suggestions in today's webinar. So whenever we stand in front of an audience or are preparing for a public speaking context, we want to avoid the situation that you see in this image. We want our audience to be engaged. We want our audience to be leaning in on our every word and to feel like they are happy to be there. That's my challenge today for kind of making sure that you as a webinar audience are engaged. And sometimes the challenges are different depending on whether or not you're giving a presentation online or in person. I think that often we tend to lose our audiences or we tend to alienate our audiences because we have some misconceptions about public speaking. And I think one of the first misconceptions that we have is that when we're preparing a presentation or speaking in front of an audience, that we think of it in terms of we have information that it's our job to convey or give to an audience. So as you see in the image here, we think of ourselves perhaps as a presenter with a kind of microphone or a bullhorn, and we're simply just kind of delivering that information to our audience. Of course, conveying information to an audience is an important part of any public speaking context. But if we think of public speaking just as conveying information to an audience, we're less likely to engage our audience and to bring them into the conversation and to leave them wanting to know more and feeling like they had an interesting experience. So I like to think of public speaking less as conveying information to an audience and more as drawing your audience in to the message that you want to share with them. So it's not that you just simply have something you want to tell them, but you want your audience to be actively involved in thinking with you about what you have to convey. So what does that mean on a practical level? I'll just give an example. Imagine if I am giving a presentation about a research subject that I study. And one way of presenting that information is simply to say, today I'd like to talk to you about the research that I study, and my research is a study of X, Y, and Z. Let's say that research is focused on climate change, for example. As an audience, you would understand that information and you would think, okay, this person is going to talk to me about climate change. But would you feel compelled to listen? Probably not yet, unless you already had a strong feeling that that was a topic that you were interested in. But if I started my presentation about my research on climate change by asking you in the audience a question, how many times in the past week have you used plastic in your everyday life? And how many times have you thought about how that plastic might affect an issue like climate change? If I start with a question that is designed to encourage you as an audience to actively think about the subject matter that I'll be sharing with you, then you're more likely to be thinking along with me and to be drawn into the message that I'm sharing with you. So we can apply that in a lot of different ways to a lot of different types of topics and types of presentations, because I know they vary a lot. You might have to just give a short presentation to your team at work about a project that you're working on. Or you might be preparing an hour-long presentation for a public lecture. In either of those contexts, think of your audience as an active participant in the process. And you can encourage them and motivate them to be active by framing what you're talking about in terms of questions, in terms of connections to everyday life, or in terms of pressing issues or debates. Sometimes that might be more or less relevant depending on the particular context you're thinking about, but always remember the number one thing is to keep your audience engaged and to make sure that you're encouraging them to think actively with you. I'll share a few more specific concrete tips for doing that as we move along in today's webinar. So for today's webinar, I'm focusing on what I consider to be 3 fundamentals of public speaking. These are not the only fundamentals that I could talk about when it comes to public speaking. But for me, these are 3 that for your next presentation or the next time you have to speak in front of an audience, if you think about these 3 things, then you will make some improvement. And as with any kind of public speaking, it's something that you get better at through slow and steady steps. You can't transform from a weak public speaker to an amazing public speaker overnight. It requires a lot of bravery, a lot of courage, a lot of volunteering to speak in front of audiences or to give that next presentation in your team. So the 3 fundamentals that I want to talk about, the first is talking about preparation. And by preparation, I mean the ways that you can strategize before speaking in front of an audience in a way that is effective for helping your audience to understand and be captivated by your message. The second fundamental I'll talk about is presence. When I say presence, what I mean is the sense of confidence, enthusiasm, engagement that you convey in the course of presenting in front of an audience. So these are things like body language, gesture, vocal tone, and how you convey enthusiasm through your pacing, your tempo. We'll talk about that in detail. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of practice as a fundamental of public speaking. And we'll talk about some ways to make your practice effective. And for me, that's the most important thing. My goal today is for you at the end of the webinar to have a few concrete strategies to apply to your next presentation or public speaking context. But I don't want you to think that in order to get better or improve your public speaking, you're going to have to practice for hours on end. Most likely, if you're practicing for hours on end, that can be useful, but it might also be ineffective. So my goal is to help you to think, what are some effective ways to practice when you have just a short amount of time to do it? First, I just want to ask you and the audience a couple of poll questions. So Sam, if you would be able to pull up the first poll set. So I have two questions here. The first is, what quality do you find most engaging in a public speaker? So just choose one that matches most closely what you find most engaging in a public speaker. And the second is asking you, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your confidence as a public speaker? From 1, not at all confident, to 5, very confident. So I'll give you a moment to just answer these poll questions very quickly. And as you answer those, I want to introduce the first section. Oh, well, actually, Sam, perhaps we can share the results.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to share the results here. All right, so it looks like the majority of folks have voted. And so for question number 1, what quality do you find most engaging in a public speaker? Our top answer with 36% of the votes is enthusiasm. Next up with 27% of the votes is thoughtfulness. After that with 20% is humor. And then with 14% of the votes is persuasiveness. And finally, with 3% is authority. And then question number 2, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your confidence as a public speaker? 50% of our audience would rate themselves as average. 23% would rate themselves as above average confidence. I like that. 17% with lower than average confidence. 7% not at all confident, and then 3% very confident. Like to hear that from those 3% as well. All right, go right ahead, Michael.
Thank you so much, Sam. One of the reasons why I like to ask these questions in the beginning is just first to get a sense from you and the audience, what are the kinds of things that you value in public speaking? I think that there's no right answer to what characterizes good public speaking. It's something that each of us can ask ourselves. And one thing that I like to encourage is take a moment, when you're getting ready for your next presentation, to think about a public speaker that you admire. You think they're a great public speaker. It could be a professor that you had, it could be a public intellectual, it could be a science communicator, it could be someone on your team at work who you feel is a really good and effective public speaker and communicator. And then just put together a list and ask yourself, reflect, what does this person do that leads me to think they're a great public speaker? And how can I incorporate that more into what I do as a public speaker? I'm really glad that many of you really highly value enthusiasm, because I also feel that enthusiasm is a really important component of public speaking. There's a balance between enthusiasm and content, the message that you're conveying. If you're very enthusiastic about a message that the audience finds less persuasive, then that enthusiasm can only go so far. But if you have a great message, if you are an authority on your subject, but you don't express enthusiasm about it, your audience is much less likely to feel interested in that topic as well. I'm also glad that many of you chose enthusiasm as your top choice, because that's also something that I feel is something that can benefit from a lot of practice and getting a lot of feedback from people in terms of how do you express enthusiasm in a way that still, doesn't seem overdoing it, because I know that's a concern for people as well. And how do you really just kind of engage your audience? So in this first part, in thinking about preparation, the main message is these are ways to think about engaging your audience. In order to engage your audience, the first step that you need to do is to put yourself in the audience's shoes. And this is something that not a lot of us do often enough when we're preparing a presentation or getting ready to speak in public. We have to ask ourselves, who is our audience? And we have to ask ourselves, why are they there? What are they hoping to gain from listening to what I have to say? What do we want them to leave the presentation or the speech or the interview thinking about what was the main message. We don't always know who our audience is. So when I say this question of who is your audience is important, that doesn't always mean in a literal sense. Of course, sometimes it can be taken literally. We might know the other team members that we're preparing a presentation for or other clients. But sometimes we don't know who specifically is in our audience. And in that case, it's best to kind of make an informed guess about who would want to be in the audience for that particular situation or that particular presentation. Ask yourself, what does your audience want to learn from you and your presentation? And I like to think of this as a kind of teaching context. Imagine yourself as a teacher who has something to share with the audience, but you want your audience to be actively engaged in the learning process as well. What does your audience know already? This is a crucial question because you can lose a lot of time in a presentation by going over material or background or context that they might know already and that they might think is a little bit boring. And finally, what is something new you can offer to your audience? Whether it's giving an update on a project that you're working on or introducing a brand new topic to an audience, always think about what do you want the audience to know at the end of the presentation that they didn't necessarily know at the beginning. And that doesn't necessarily need to mean kind of specific content. It could be a new perspective on something. It could also just be a new perspective on what you think about a topic, which is important as well. When it comes to thinking about knowing your audience and engaging your audience in a public speaking context, keep in mind that audiences can be easily distracted. And this is even more so in an format where your audience could be doing anything while they're listening to you. And I recognize that in this webinar, you might be having lunch, you might be doing laundry, you might be doing something else, or you might be very focused on the information that I'm presenting. But I don't assume that. I want to make sure that I'm having multiple points in my presentation where I'm kind of trying to bring you back in to the message that I'm trying to share and to kind of try to focus your attention back on the learning process for the webinar. So don't just convey information, think about ways to motivate your audience to listen and to learn more. So what are some ways to motivate your audience to listen and learn more? First, I think just conveying your own excitement is a great way to motivate your audience. As I think many of you already identified in choosing enthusiasm as the kind of top choice for what you value in a public speaker. It can't be underestimated to begin a presentation by directly acknowledging your excitement. You don't necessarily need to use that word excitement depending on the context, but you could just say, I'm really looking forward to talking about X, Y, and Z with you today. Or if you're giving a project update, conveying some sense of enthusiasm about the updates that you have to share. Another way to motivate your audience is to let the audience know your goals for the presentation. I think this is really crucial. If an audience within the first 30 seconds or minute of your presentation does not know what your objective is, then they're more likely to start looking at their watch. They're more likely to feel like they don't know where you're going. And unless you're a really great storyteller and kind of building up that excitement or that enthusiasm gradually, eventually they're going to feel like, well, if I don't know where you're going, I'm just going to tune out a little bit. So really focus on capturing your audience's attention in the first 30 seconds. When it comes to thinking about public speaking style and making sure to convey enthusiasm, to use facial expression and vocal tone and variety to convey that enthusiasm and grab your audience's attention, it can be exhausting to feel like you have to do that from beginning to end of an entire presentation. And I don't think that you do need to do that. Instead, choose strategic moments in your presentation where you want to really kind of emphasize or ramp up your own sense of engaging with the audience. The first 30 seconds is an important time to do that. Of course, the conclusion, the last 30 seconds to a minute, is an important time to really re-engage with that sense of energy and enthusiasm. But also choose 2 or 3 transition moments in your presentation or a moment where you're presenting the key message or the key argument. And when you're preparing, tell yourself that that's a moment where you're going to maybe write in your notes that you're going to recapture that energy and enthusiasm that you had in the first 30 seconds. It's important to find multiple moments in especially a longer presentation to grab that audience's attention again. That relates broadly to the second step to keep in mind when preparing a presentation. And that's to make sure that you're always crafting a take-home message for your presentation and thinking about how can you convey that take-home message to your audience in a way that will help them to remember it. So what is a take-home message? A take-home message is a simple unifying theme that conveys the combined importance of your presentation. One presentation can have multiple take-home messages, or it can just have one take-home message, or it can have a kind of broad, big picture take-home message that has a couple of smaller components to it. So I don't mean to suggest that every presentation needs to just have one single thing that it's remembered for. But it's really crucial to ask yourself before any presentation, what do you want the audience to remember the next day or the next week? And most likely it will just be something very short, very simple, but kind of ideally encapsulating the big picture of what you wanted to convey. So it's not enough just to think what is your take-home message, but also think how can you convey it with the most impact? So it has the most impact when it's simple and it's direct. And when I say it's direct, what I mean is when you're giving a presentation to an audience, it can help to give signals that you're coming to an important part of your message. If you have 10 things to say and you just say them all with the same kind of emphasis and all with the same kind of sense of importance, your audience might not know, well, what should they remember? That's a lot of things for them to process, and they didn't really get a sense for what was the priority. But if you have 10 things to convey to an audience, but you know there are 2 things that are really important you want them to know above all, when you get to those 2 things, tell your audience, say something like, now I'm getting to the main core of my argument. Or tell your audience, now here, I want you to really kind of focus in on this because this is the most important thing I want to convey to you. If you use that kind of framing language, it's more likely your audience will follow along with that important or significant thing that you want to convey and will remember it as well. And that's really ultimately the goal, for people to remember what we have to say. So another way to convey the impact of your take-home message is to emphasize it at both the beginning and the conclusion of your presentation. If you just mention it at the beginning, but then kind of forget about it, it's less likely that the audience will really kind of process it and remember it. And also think about how you use visual aids like a PowerPoint slide or handouts to reinforce this central take-home message. When it comes to the question of visual aids and especially any kind of slide presentation, my philosophy is that the best slide presentation is one that simplifies your message and highlights what you want the audience to remember. Sometimes we think of it in the reverse way. We think, well, I've got a lot of stuff that I want to convey to the audience. There's only so much that I can say, so I'll just put all of that extra information onto a slide. Perfect. The audience will see it. But put yourself into the audience's shoes. When they see a slide that's really busy, that has a ton of information, and it's not necessarily information that you're reinforcing with your words, it can be confusing for an audience. It can be off-putting. So I like to emphasize fewer words on the slide, but make sure that they're worth it. So in terms of thinking about the bigger picture organization of any kind of presentation or public speaking, start with the big picture framework and one that highlights your takeaway message. That's not to say that it can sometimes be effective to start with an opening anecdote or a detail that you want to share, but make sure that that is not kind of too long before you get to that central take-home message. Oftentimes, and I myself as an audience member, I like when presenters start off with a kind of story. But if it starts to kind of go more than a minute or two, and I'm not really sure where is that story going or how does this connect with the bigger picture, I start to get less involved. But as you get further into the presentation, that's the time to start in with specific examples that highlight and support your take-home message, but make sure that you're returning to that big take-home message, the big picture in the conclusion. So the third step that I wanted to talk about in terms of the preparation for a presentation is to prepare a roadmap for yourself and for your audience. So what do I mean by preparing a roadmap? A roadmap is a way of telling your audience where you're going and what they will learn in a presentation. And if they know that, they're more likely to follow you there. It's a way of creating expectations so you can heighten their interest. So a few ways of presenting to your audience a roadmap. The classic way of doing this is just to have a slide like I did at the beginning of today's presentation, where I talk about the 3 parts of my presentation, and I just give a kind of brief overview to you as an audience. Here's what I'm going to be talking about. In part 1, I'll be talking about preparation. In part 2, I'll be talking about presence. In part 3, I'll be talking about practice, and then moving on. But that's, can sometimes be a little bit boring. There can be more interesting ways of presenting to your audience a roadmap as well. You can be clear about what you want them to take away from the presentation. Using language like, by the end of this presentation, I hope that you will have a better understanding of topic X, Y, and Z. Or saying something like, when you leave this presentation, I hope that you're thinking about the question of X. And that can be a good way of just kind of showing the audience you have a goal and you want them to follow along with you in reaching that goal. Introductions are a really important part of an opportunity to share that roadmap with your audience and to heighten those expectations. Whether or not you're reading from a script or reading from PowerPoint slides or just completely improvising, based on your preparation, the introduction is always a good moment to speak directly to the audience, make eye contact, whether it's online, looking at your laptop camera, or in person, making eye contact with a few different people or sections of the audience. Thank the audience for being there. I find that thanking the audience for being there kind of helps to calm my nerves a little bit and just shows that I'm happy to be here. But also in your introduction, make sure you're talking about the central topic and the basic plan of your presentation clearly and directly. And that's the best way for the audience to really kind of have an understanding of the big picture framework that you'll be talking about. And then the details and the evidence is a way of supporting that big picture framework. So just as a recap of preparing for a presentation and some key steps and strategies to think about in that preparation. We talked about knowing your audience and thinking about, based on that knowledge of who your audience is or who you expect them to be, how can you motivate them and think about ways of engaging your audience right from the beginning. We talked about creating a take-home message, a kind of big picture framework around which all of the details of your message can be oriented. And finally, thinking about preparing a roadmap for yourself and for your audience. All of these steps have a little bit more to do with your message and the content of your message. They kind of relate a little bit more to the bigger picture structure and organization of your presentation or whatever kind of public speaking you're getting ready for. And you might be thinking, well, public speaking, isn't that about how you incorporate, how you kind of show confidence and enthusiasm with your body language, with your facial expressions, with your tone of voice? It is, certainly. And that's what I'll be talking about next when I talk about presence. But I wanted to start with structure and organization because I see those two as intertwined, interlinked. If you have great presence and great delivery, but you're not really thinking about how to structure your message and how to engage your audience, then the two might seem a little bit disconnected. So let's talk now about presence, the second fundamental of public speaking that I want to discuss with you today. I like to think of presence in terms of two different big picture categories to think of. when reflecting on public speaking. The first is bodily presence. And with that, I mean things like your stance. Certainly if you're presenting in front of an in-person audience, thinking about stance and thinking about body is different than if you're presenting in front of an online audience. And I know that probably for most, if not all of you, right now we're thinking about online contexts. But stance is still important in an online context too. And stance can be a component of sitting down in a chair in front of your computer as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But other things to keep in mind are motion. In an online context, there are fewer opportunities for moving around. We tend to just kind of choose one fixed point, and that's okay as well. But there are ways that we can kind of convey motion in other ways with, let's say, for example, how we might go closer to the screen or further away from the screen, or even just kind of the distance that we have from the screen. And another thing to think about is gesture. Typically kind of how we use our hands to communicate things as well. I like to think of each of these three components of bodily presence as having a home base and then a range of ways in which we depart from that home base and then return to it. So with stance, for example, we might have a way that feels comfortable and confident for us when we're sitting in a chair about to deliver a presentation or talk in public online. And that might be our kind of home base. But there might be moments in a presentation online where I might want to move a little bit closer to the camera to convey a little bit more of engagement with the audience. But then I want to make sure that I'm returning to that home base. I think one of the biggest mistakes that public speakers make often is incorporating motion, incorporating gesture, incorporating variations in body language, but not really having any center to which those variations return. And if there's no center to which those variations return, it just seems like we're flailing about. And as an audience, you might start to lose a sense that we as a speaker, or I as a speaker, are kind of grounded and kind of are intentional about these movements. The second element of presence is voice. How you think of your voice as allowing you to convey all of those additional aspects of communication that aren't strictly conveyed by the words alone. There's a reason your audience has decided to listen to you and not just read the words that you're writing on a page. The elements of voice that I like to focus on first are volume. To a certain extent, I think that this is something that is often more significant to think about in an in-person setting when we don't have a microphone. In an in-person setting, oftentimes speaking with too low of a volume is a really big fundamental mistake in public speaking. And it's often because we're not thinking enough about how to differentiate our conversational voice when we're just having a one-on-one conversation with another individual, with our presentational voice, which is the volume that we need to have in order for the last person in the last row of our audience to be able to have that feeling that we're having a conversation with them as well, and not just with the people in the front of the audience. Of course, this is going to be different in an online setting where we just have a kind of, we're just speaking to the microphones in our laptops or other devices. But we also do want to make sure that we're using a little bit of a presentational volume when we're presenting online as well. If you raise your volume just a notch or two above your conversational volume, oftentimes audiences perceive that raise in volume as a sign of confidence and as a sign of enthusiasm and authority. Tempo is another important element of voice and vocal presence. When we get nervous, we tend to rush through what we're saying. And we rush through what we're saying because we're not giving ourselves enough time to breathe. And when we get nervous, we need more breath. Our heart rate increases a little bit. We're kind of rushing to get to that next time we can pause or stop. So in order to address that, I like to suggest give yourself a system for pausing in a systematic way when you're doing a presentation. Tell yourself that at the end of every 3 sentences, you'll pause for 2 seconds, 1 or 2 seconds. Take a conscious breath. Or every time you switch from one slide to another, before jumping right into the content and those details, you'll take a pause, you'll take a breath in and take a breath out. It doesn't have to be long, it can be as short as just a second in, a second out. But doing it consciously and doing it intentionally slows down our pace, helps with our nervousness because we're giving ourselves that opportunity to take a breath. And that's helping with our heart rate and other aspects, other symptoms of nervousness. It's also crucially giving your audience a chance to process what you've said before. And that's really important for them to remember what you're saying. And the third element of presence is emphasis. Thinking about how you strategically emphasize certain words, individual phrases, or even broader sections of your presentation so that your audience knows what is important for you. I'll go back to a point I made earlier in today's webinar where I mentioned that the first 30 seconds are crucial. And then there are other moments that it's up to you to decide what are the crucial moments in your presentation. You don't need to emphasize every word or emphasize words throughout the entire course of your presentation. But if you do that in the first 30 seconds or minute of your presentation, your audience will get that feeling that you are conveying what's significant. And then the audience will rest a little bit as well, and they won't necessarily expect it through the entire presentation. A few things that I want to zero in on a little bit more specifically. The first is body language. And again, this is a little bit different in an online setting, but I think it's important for us to all be ready for those moments when we'll be back in in-person settings as well, and able to incorporate a little bit more body language into our public speaking as well. The first 30 seconds are crucial. When it comes to body language, when we're doing an in-person presentation, one thing that I notice a lot is, let's say if the speaker is walking up to a podium and then they stand at the podium and then they face the audience and they start presenting. Sometimes presenters will start their presentation before they've even looked up at the audience. Sometimes before they've even really kind of had that chance to stand at the podium, breathe for a couple of seconds, look at the audience, make eye contact, and then begin the presentation. And then the audience is just kind of like caught off guard. And they're thinking, oh, wait a second, you as a presenter did not take that opportunity to, really just kind of establish that sense of connection with the audience before starting. Face the audience as much as possible when you're in an in-person setting. When you're in an online setting, try to make sure that your camera is positioned in a way that your shoulders are kind of evenly spaced in the frame, and the audience is really kind of able to focus on your message, and also to read some of your facial expression. I think facial expression is a little bit more important in an online presentation than in an in-person setting. It's important in both contexts, but in many video settings, this one included, you as an audience are able to see my facial expressions in a little bit more of a close-up manner than if we were in a lecture hall, for example. So keep that in mind. Chin up and shoulders back. And when I say this, my purpose is not just for the sake of, well, that looks authoritative. My purpose in saying chin up and shoulders back is that is a stance that opens up your lungs to be able to take more breath. And when you're taking more breath, even if subconsciously, that helps with some of the other signs of nervousness, in addition to conveying confidence and enthusiasm to your audience. Be aware of the distance between you and the audience. Or in the case of an online presentation, be aware of the distance between you and the camera. In an in-person presentation, one of the biggest mistakes I see is, let's say if you're at a whiteboard giving a presentation and the first row of chairs is maybe 15 feet from the whiteboard, and you decide to stand directly at the whiteboard instead of halfway between the whiteboard and the audience. Now, of course, in moments where you might be needing to use the whiteboard and write things on it, then you'll of course need to be right next to the whiteboard. But think about kind of splitting the distance between you and your audience. If you're far away from your audience, that often kind of reads as nervousness or reads as a kind of not wanting to be there. If you're too close to your audience might start to feel a little bit uncomfortable as well. So what's important is that to keep in mind is that the context is important. What kind of room you're in, or if you're in an online presentational format, how is the audience seeing you? Those are important things to keep in mind as well. When it comes to eye contact, in an in-person setting, make sure you establish eye contact before you begin speaking. Even if you're reading from a script, you have paper or notes in front of you, or you have a PowerPoint presentation behind you, the first thing you should say, you should be looking directly at the audience, not looking at your notes, not looking at your PowerPoint. Same thing for an online presentation. The first thing you say, look directly at the camera. That's not a time to be looking at your notes or looking off screen at something else. I like to differentiate between half eye contact and full eye contact. Half eye contact is, let's say if you're reading from a script and you just kind of look up after every 2 or 3 sentences. You're not necessarily kind of pausing or lingering with that eye contact, but just showing the audience that you recognize and you acknowledge their presence. Full eye contact is something that you want to employ when you want the audience actually to know that you're coming up on something important. You want them to remember what you're saying, you're coming to a central argument, or you're coming to an important transition point in your presentation. That's a moment to kind of establish full eye contact and incorporate a pause so the audience knows that even if subconsciously, what's coming next is important. Make eye contact, this is something more for an in-person setting with different zones of the audience. You could make great eye contact with just one zone or one person in the audience, but if you're not kind of alternating that eye contact, it might start to feel like certain members of the audience are feeling a little bit alienated. Volume and vocal variety. I like to think of volume as a scale from 1 to 10. 3 or 4 is your typical volume for a conversation. And that 3 or 4 is going to be different for every person. If you're if you're doing a presentation without a microphone and it's an in-person setting, you should be somewhere at a 7 or an 8. Not screaming, but still kind of conveying that you're in a presentational mode, speaking a little bit more loudly than you would in a conversational mode. I think variety is really important for conveying a sense of enthusiasm and for engaging your audience. There are a lot of different things that you can vary in your delivery and in your presence. You can vary the pacing. Sometimes you might want to go a little bit faster. Sometimes you might want to slow down the pace to let you know, I'm coming here to a central point of my argument. Pauses are something that can be varied. Think of pauses maybe of having 3 different types of pauses. The 1-second pause that you might use between sentences or between paragraphs. The 2 or 3 second pause that you might use in transitioning from one slide to another or from one section to another. And then perhaps sometimes you might incorporate once or twice through a presentation a more dramatic pause of 4 or 5 seconds, maybe after you ask a rhetorical question and you want the audience to really just kind of think about that question. Emphasis is something also that can be a part of vocal variety. I think especially for the opening sentences of your presentation, ask yourself, what are the main keywords that you can emphasize to show to your audience that you're not just conveying information, but you have a kind of emotional or a kind of communicative way of thinking about your message as well. And your tone of voice. It's important to think about how do you convey through your tone of voice a sense of enthusiasm or a sense of concern, depending on the topic that you're addressing, or a sense of possibility or sense of wonder or excitement. These are all things that you can use tone of voice to vary and convey to the audience. So we all get nervous during a presentation, so I wanted to make sure that I address some ways to help with nervousness. And Sam, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the second set of poll questions for the audience. So these questions, the first is, which of these is closest to your biggest fear about public speaking? So just choose one that is just kind of something that you might get nervous about in public speaking. The second is about practice. So the next section we'll talk about how often do you practice your presentations in advance. So I'll give you a moment to fill out those polls. And in the meantime, I just want to let everyone know you're not alone in being nervous when you give a presentation. It's something that affects many of us. And in fact, I get, when someone tells me they don't get nervous by public speaking, then I'm more concerned, because to me, that means they might care less about it. Sam, do we have the results?
We do. I'm sharing them right now. All right. So for question number 1, let's see. It looks like the largest percentage, 27% of attendees say that they'll forget what they wanted to say. Next up, with 25% of attendees thinking that their voice will get shaky, hard to control. 20% of the audience thinks that the audience won't know what I'm talking about. And then 17% say that the people in the audience will get bored. That's a fear. 11% say that their body will get jittery and they'll feel uncomfortable. For question number 2, how often do you practice your presentations in advance? 40% of our audience say more than twice. 28% say twice. 23% say once. And then 10% coming in at the end say not at all.
Great, thank you, Sam. I'm impressed that 40% of you practice a presentation more than twice. I think that that's great. And when it comes to thinking about what makes people nervous during a presentation, I'll talk a little bit about a strategy for when you feel like your voice is going to shake or you're getting a little bit jittery. When it comes to being afraid of forgetting something in a presentation, this kind of gets back to the preparation component. I think any presentation, no matter whether you're reading from a script or just kind of improvising or going off the cuff, think about a presentation as having multiple landing points. And each landing point will be a kind of central part of your presentation. So if you feel like you get lost or you're not sure, you forgot what to say, your first thought should be, what's my next landing point in the structure of my presentation? And those landing points are things that you should be really trying to absorb and kind of make a part of your own before a presentation, so that if you do feel like you're lost, you can easily say, okay, well, let me just skip to the next landing point. The audience won't often even know if you've skipped over anything. And sometimes it's also okay to tell an audience, let me just get to the next kind of main point or main part of my presentation. So a few things to keep in mind to help with nervousness. The first, and again, this is kind of more for in-person presentations, but depending on the context, it could be with an online setting as well. Speak with people in your audience before you give a presentation. Oftentimes we get nervous because of that gap between silence and then all of a sudden I'm in front of an audience and I have to speak. So just having some conversations with people ahead of time helps you learn about your audience. It also helps to kind of narrow that gap between not saying anything and saying something. Focus on supportive audience members. This is something that helps me a lot. It's one reason why I find it a little bit challenging to present in an online format. I like in the beginning of a presentation to kind of notice who are the people who are nodding their heads or smiling a little bit more or kind of seem a little bit more attentive and a little bit more awake. And those are the people that I'm going to turn my eye contact to or turn my attention to if I'm starting to feel my confidence dip a little bit, because it helps me to feel that, okay, that person is enjoying it. I know that more people are enjoying it, but let's face it, sometimes we're tired in an audience. Sometimes we have other things on our mind. And I think it's important as a presenter, as a public speaker, to be kind to ourselves as well and realize if someone looks tired or someone looks bored, it's often not about you as a speaker. They just have other things on their mind. The third, and this is the most important thing, is to create a checklist of the things that make you nervous. This checklist will be different for all of you, but once you have that checklist, think about a concrete action that you can take to address that item on the checklist. What I mean is, let's say if you have a problem with shaky hands when you get nervous. Think about a concrete thing that you'll do if you start to feel your hands get a little bit shaky in that presentation. Like you'll make larger gestures. That might help, it might not. It's important to think of this as trial and error. Or perhaps some people find it helpful to hold their thumb and index finger together for 10 seconds or so, just to kind of prevent that shaking. Or maybe hold on to something like your phone or a clicker if you're using one. If you get a shaky voice, it's often because we're not giving ourselves enough breath. So think about taking a deep breath. Think about slowing down your tempo to give yourself more pausing to take those breaths. And focus on a sympathetic audience member. Think about those strategies that will work for you to help increase your confidence and lower your nerves a little bit. Finally, I want to conclude before having some time for questions with thinking about some effective practice strategies. I don't think that being a good public speaker is an innate talent. It's something that can be practiced and improved. But oftentimes we don't really take those opportunities to practice. If a supervisor or a professor says, who wants to give a presentation next week? Most people keep their hands down and wait until someone else volunteers. If you want to become a better public speaker, take those opportunities to volunteer. And it has great effects in other ways as well. It's great for career development to take those opportunities to volunteer to give presentations. A few ways to make your practice more effective. First, practice in the way that you will present. If you'll be presenting while standing up, practice while standing up. If you'll be sitting down, practice while sitting down. Practice out loud. It's not enough just to go through your script or your notes in your head. We have to get familiar and used to the sound of our voices when we're speaking out loud. And so practicing out loud is the best way to do that. Practice in front of other people or in an online setting. Set up a Zoom meeting ahead of time so you can practice with, what does it look like to see other people's faces in the meeting setting while you're presenting? It's important to know how you respond so that you can develop strategies for improving on that. As I mentioned, if you're standing, practice while you're stand. If you're sitting, practice while you're sitting. You might want to wear what you'll be wearing during a presentation just to get a sense for how that affects your confidence or your feeling of comfort. And practice with your PowerPoint or other visual aids. Oftentimes when we practice, we just kind of breeze through the PowerPoint, or we don't really think how much time does it actually take to click through the slides or click through the animations. So finally, just a few parting words on how to become a better public speaker. The first is awareness. A lot of the things that I focused on today have to do with being aware of what is your style of public speaking. What do you notice about your last presentation that you wanted to improve? And how can you create a plan for specifically addressing that in your next presentation? Reflection, I think, is important. Asking yourself, what are the qualities that you admire in good public speakers? How can you incorporate more of that into your own practice as a public speaker? And finally, setting goals. I think set small goals that are easily accomplished. So my goal for my next presentation might be to think a little bit more strategically about incorporating pauses when I transition from one slide to another. And that might be my only goal for the next presentation, but if I feel I accomplished it, I might set more goals for the future. So at this point, I'll ask Sam if there are any questions that came up in the Q&A box.
Yeah, we've got a few questions flying in here. We'll do a little lightning round Q&A at the end of the presentation. So first of all, we've got 2 questions about webinar presentations in particular. So I'll lump those together. Is there a general recommendation that you have, Michael, regarding the length of webinars? And then if we're thinking about volume on a scale from 1 to 10, how loudly should we speak for a webinar or for an online presentation? We're getting a little meta here, right? Webinar within a webinar.
So that's a really interesting question. How long should a webinar be? I think it really depends on what are your goals for that webinar and what do you know about your audience in terms of how much time do they have available? What might be their motivations for signing up for that webinar and for joining it? Typically the webinars that I do are 1 hour long, and that's not for any particular reason other than that in the context of the University of Chicago, a lot of workshops tend to be an hour. But if I knew my audience, maybe if I'm planning a webinar to have just kind of one specific message, or let's say I'm kind of, I want to talk about a product that I want people to get interested in, or I want to convey results to a client, or I want to kind of dialogue with potential clients. then I might think a little bit shorter. Maybe 30 minutes might be a little bit more effective in that context. The other question about, so volume. When you're in a kind of online setting or a webinar setting, how should you think about your volume? Well, if 3 or 4 is a conversational volume and 7 or 8 is what I might suggest for an in-person kind of large room, I would say anywhere from, I would say 5 or 6 for volume in a webinar. Mainly because I think just making that volume a little bit louder than conversational conveys to your audience that this is different than just a conversation. But sometimes depending on your microphone, if you go above that, if you go to kind of a 7 or 8, there might be some kind of, it might seem too loud for a webinar audience.
Great, and we probably have time for about 2 more quick questions here, and here's a great one, knowing that this is our young alumni audience here. What would you recommend if you get feedback about coming off as young in a presentation?
Yeah, this is another one where if we were just having a conversation, I would want to ask a lot more questions about the context of the feedback, the context of the presentation, because that is problematic. You know, we don't want feedback to be focused on our age, our gender, our race, other kinds of aspects. So I think the first thing is just to kind of think about the context, kind of think about what might have led that person who gave you that feedback to say that. And it might just be that it's that person, and you know, other people might not give that same feedback. The other thing that I would suggest, so perhaps my first kind of concrete next step would be to seek a wider range of feedback. You know, if it's in a work setting and someone on your team said, "Oh, you came across too young," you know, seek advice and input from other people on your team who might have seen that same presentation, and ask questions as well. You know, anytime you're getting feedback from someone, it shouldn't just be a one-way street of someone saying, "This was good, this wasn't good." But think about, what questions do you ask in response? What questions can you ask in terms of getting some more feedback, and a question like, "Oh, I'm curious to know what made you feel that way. I'm curious to know what could I change about my presentation style in order to address that."
Great. And then our final question here, we've gotten a few questions about this. So what are your strategies for memorizing your key points and feeling prepared, but not sounding maybe robotic or formulaic in your presentation?
Right. So I think often one thing that helps for me is to be very selective about the key points or arguments or things that I want to make sure that I know exactly how I'm going to say before a presentation. Because if I overload myself by thinking, well, I want to memorize an entire 5-minute introduction, I'm more likely to kind of feel like I've forgotten something in the moment. So I try to be selective for every presentation. I would say maybe kind of one key point for every 5 to 10 minutes. And so if it's an hour-long presentation, then, you know, I'm just going to want to memorize a kind of small handful of key points. And I find that writing them down a couple of times before a presentation helps me to remember. So I might write them down on a fresh piece of paper once a day, and then also 30 minutes or 15 minutes before my presentation. And then I'll have those notes with me when I'm giving the presentation as well, so that the process of writing helps me to remember it. But then also kind of that gives me a kind of way to just kind of briefly remind myself if I need to consult notes. And oftentimes it's okay to consult notes as well.
Great. And I know we have a few other questions that have come through. Michael has generously put his email address here, so do feel free to reach out if you feel like your questions haven't gotten answered today. I will just wrap it up with a few points. The Young Alumni Career Development Series continues all summer long with free online professional development webinars for young alums. Anyone who's graduated within the last 10 years is what this program has been designed for. And we've also included some networking opportunities online as well. Join us for the next webinar of our series that'll be taking place Thursday, July 9th, and that's titled Building Your Story Matrix, Strategies for Success in a Behavioral Interview. We'll discuss tips and strategies for anticipating questions and developing concise and effective responses in an interview setting. This could be a great follow-up to Michael's presentation today. We're also going to be hosting our regular online Alumni Coffee and Conversations networking event next Friday, July 10th, where you'll be paired randomly with alumni from all over the world for a series of speed networking video conversations over Zoom. A great opportunity to put your newly acquired public speaking skills online to the test. And finally, I would encourage you to join the UChicago Alumni LinkedIn group if you haven't already. And I'll send you a link to this group in my email. This is a great way to grow your UChicago alumni network. You can visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for a full list of our upcoming events and programs. And you'll see a survey at the close of this meeting. So please do share your feedback. We're always looking for ways to improve our programs. And I hope to share some great kudos on our presentation today with Michael. Michael, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, for sharing some great actionable tips with us today. And to everyone joining us online, take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.